In NBA history, Scottie Pippen is recognized by the numbers and titles that any player would dream of. 6 NBA championships with the Chicago Bulls, 7 times selected as an NBA All-Star, 7 times named to the NBA All-Defensive First Team, 3 times making an All-NBA team, 2 Olympic gold medals with Team USA in lineups considered the greatest in basketball history, including the Dream Team of 1992. He is one of the very few players in history who could defend every position, handle the ball like a guard, pass like a point guard, and score when the team needed it most. The Bulls' peak seasons weren't built just on clutch shots, but on Scottie Pippen's ability to dominate the entire court, carrying the entire defensive system, transitioning play, and setting the tempo for a dynasty that lasted nearly a decade. His name is enshrined in the Hall of Fame, his jersey retired forever, his stat sheet filled with milestones that history has no choice but to acknowledge. Without Scottie Pippen, the Chicago Bulls would never have become an empire. But right from there, the quiet tragedy began, because all that glory seems to always be told as a footnote to another story. Behind the shining titles was a man who had to learn to live 2 parallel lives. One, Scottie Pippen, on the court strong, irreplaceable, willing to take on the heaviest burdens so the winning machine could run perfectly, and one Scottie Pippen off the lights, carrying the pain of being diminished, undervalued, asked to stay silent for the greater good. He endured unfair contracts because of family burdens, endured being sidelined from decisive moments, endured history passing right by his name without pausing long enough. Scottie Pippen's will wasn't in the shots or the dunks, but in the ability to keep standing when he knew he was sacrificing so others could shine, in still showing up every night with a hurting body and an eroded ego, in choosing to live both lives at once without allowing himself to collapse. Scottie Pippen survived the NBA, survived the harshest seasons. But what's more haunting is the question that still hangs in the air. Can he survive the way history has been and continues to tell his life? If you want to keep diving deeper into this story that has never been fully told, please hit subscribe to the channel and drop a like to join us on this journey. Scottie Pippen was born in Hamburg, Arkansas, a small town so poor that poverty wasn't measured in money anymore, but in the absence of hope. There, people didn't grow up with dreams, because dreaming was a luxury for families who still had to count every meal, every electric bill, every pill bought on credit. For Scottie Pippen, childhood didn't start with the question, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" but with a much simpler one, "How can the whole family survive one more day?" His family had 12 children, crammed into a tight space, where the kids' voices mixed with the labored breathing of adults, and every morning waking up was a test to see what else would come crashing down on them that day. Scottie's father, Preston Pippen, had once been the family's sole pillar, until a sudden stroke took away his ability to walk, turning a working man into an immobile body lying in the middle of the poor house. Not long after, Scottie's brother suffered an accident that left him permanently disabled. Under the same roof, 2 men who had been the main supports now lay helpless against fate, and the burden fell on the mother and the children who hadn't yet learned what childhood even was. Scottie grew up surrounded by sounds no child should have to hear day and night. The steady, cold hiss of a breathing machine, the ticking clock running parallel to medical bills that might never get paid off, and above all, the heavy silence of the adults, a silence born from the helplessness of no longer being able to shield their children from poverty and illness. No one in the family had time to teach Scottie how to dream, let alone how to fight back or demand anything. The only thing he learned, naturally and cruelly, was how to endure, how to yield, and how to keep moving forward even when there was nothing left to hope for. Scottie's childhood had no carefree afternoons or long summers. It was shaped by responsibility arriving too early, by the awareness that if he didn't push through, the whole family would collapse again. He learned to notice others' pain before recognizing his own, learned to step aside so the weaker ones got priority, learned to accept that the world owed him no explanation. In that environment, basketball didn't appear as a saving dream, but as a faint escape, a fragile chance to break out of the cycle of poverty. But even when he held the ball, Scottie still carried the mindset of a child raised in helplessness, never demanding, never believing he deserved more, never daring to think life could place him at the center. He grew taller, stronger, but inside, he remained the boy used to living in a house where everything was scarce except responsibility. That very childhood forged Scottie Pippen in the harshest way. It didn't teach him how to win, but how to endure failure without being allowed to fall. It didn't teach him how to rise up and fight for his place, but how to stand firm so others could lean on him. When he grew up, the world would call it sacrifice, teamwork, noble virtue. But for Scottie, it was all just a continuation of what he'd learned very early. In a life where you don't get to choose, the only thing you can do is keep walking, quietly carrying others' burdens, and hope that one day that endurance will mean something. The childhood poverty and years of living with helplessness didn't end when Scottie Pippen left the cramped house in Hamburg, Arkansas. They only changed form and followed him into another phase, where the loneliness no longer came from illness or bills, but from invisibility. While boys his age were scouted, called by name, placed on lists of promising talents, Scottie stood outside every spotlight. No one chased him. No one waited. No one believed that skinny teenager had anything special worth keeping. Basketball, once again, didn't open any doors. It only gave Scottie a narrow hallway to slip through. He entered college not as an expected athlete, but as an extra who happened to show up when the team needed another pair of hands. At the University of Central Arkansas, Scottie was initially not even seen as a player. He was the team manager, cleaning up, assisting, standing on the sideline watching others play, as if his natural role was to stay in the background. No one came to tell him you deserve more. No moment of selection to change his fate. And so Scottie learned the familiar lessons from childhood. But this time, in a new space. Stay silent to survive. Give way so you aren't cut. Don't ask for your share, because even the smallest piece might be taken if you open your mouth. Scottie's body began to change in ways even he couldn't fully grasp. He shot up suddenly, inch by inch, as if life was quietly handing him a tool he'd never been taught to use. His wingspan lengthened, his strides grew stronger, but his self-belief stayed frozen far behind. To others, Scottie started to look like a basketball player. To himself, he was still the boy from Hamburg, Arkansas, used to feeling unchosen. He took the court with the mindset of someone always ready to be replaced, always thinking that one mistake and that fragile door would slam shut forever. No one taught Scottie how to promote himself, how to fight for the spotlight, how to speak his own value. He only knew how to work, to do more than asked, to keep going until no one could deny his presence anymore. But even then, that presence remained quiet. No applause, no glowing praise. Scottie's college years passed like that, in a state of limbo between being and not being, between acceptance and being forgotten. He played better every day, defended fiercely, passed smartly, but every step forward came with a question that was never answered. Do I really belong here, or am I just being tolerated a little longer? When others talked about potential, Scottie talked about responsibility. When others thought about the future, Scottie thought about not being allowed to fail. That was the invisible legacy of a childhood no one came to save. You don't wait for miracles. You don't believe someone will catch you when you fall. You just learn to stand up in silence and keep walking, even when you don't know where you're going. By the time Scottie started drawing faint attention from scouts, he still couldn't believe it was real. Every compliment was met with caution. Every opportunity treated as something that could vanish at any moment. His body was now big enough to make others look, but his mind remained trapped in the role of someone never expected. And that very disconnect between a rising body and a belief that never caught up shaped Scottie Pippen most profoundly. It turned him into a player who always put the team first, but it also turned him into a man accustomed to living in his own shadow. No one came to save Scottie Pippen when he was young, and so when the last chance knocked, he didn't step out with the confidence of the chosen, but with the wariness of someone too familiar with being left behind. It was from that foundation, a foundation of silence, yielding, and absent self-belief, that the path leading Scottie into the NBA began to form, not as a fairy tale, but as the cold continuation of a life that had learned early how to survive without expecting anyone to come save him. When Scottie Pippen stepped into the NBA draft in 1987, it wasn't a moment of roaring applause or welcoming spotlights, but the cold continuation of a life already accustomed to being seen and then immediately overlooked. His name was called not as a declaration or a promise, but as a formality, and almost immediately he was traded away in a deal he didn't control, wasn't asked about, and wasn't explained. Drafted and traded on the same night, a story so brutally concise it etched deep into the mind of a young man raised in poverty, that even when you reach the highest threshold, you can still be treated like movable merchandise. No welcoming moment, no celebratory press conference, no one saying, "We believe in you." Scottie entered the NBA with a small suitcase and the familiar feeling that he was standing in the wrong place, that this wasn't a space meant for people like him, people who didn't know how to demand, how to negotiate, how to place themselves at the center of the story. The Chicago Bulls welcomed Scottie not with dreams of a new star, but with a very specific and very pragmatic need. They didn't need more spotlight. They needed someone willing to do the work no one else wanted. In a team being built around one name, already destined to become the center of the universe, Scottie immediately understood his role. He wasn't there to make a personal mark, wasn't there to tell his own story. He was there to fill the gaps, to patch the cracks, to shoulder the silent tasks that kept the system running smoothly. For Scottie Pippen, the NBA didn't open like a dazzling stage, but like a massive factory, where every person was valued by their ability to serve the winning machine. And Scottie, carrying the legacy of a childhood no one came to save, quickly learned to adapt. Stay silent, observe, work more than required, don't complain. He walked into the Bulls' locker room with the awareness that he wasn't allowed to disrupt the established order, that his existence was only tolerated when it helped others shine brighter. No one said it out loud, but it was present in every glance, every instruction, every assigned role. Scottie didn't resist, because resistance had never been the language life taught him. He remembered the years in Hamburg, Arkansas, where pushing back didn't fill the dinner table, where silence was the only way to keep the family standing. And so, in the NBA, he continued doing what he did best: endure. Being traded on draft night wasn't just a transaction. It was the league's first message to Scottie that he didn't belong anywhere long enough to be called chosen. He existed to meet others' needs, to be moved when necessary, to adapt when pushed into a structure he didn't create. The Chicago Bulls saw in Scottie something valuable but hard to market: the willingness to sacrifice. Not the sacrifice celebrated on front pages, but the quiet, prolonged, slowly eroding kind. They needed someone who ran non-stop so others could rest, someone who defended the toughest positions so others could focus on scoring, someone who accepted being called secondary so the main story stayed clear. Scottie understood that faster than anyone, because life had prepared him for this lesson from very early on. He didn't ask why he wasn't welcomed, didn't ask why he was traded like goods, didn't ask why his NBA dream began with the feeling of being discarded. He just told himself that if he did well enough, worked hard enough, dedicated himself enough, then maybe one day someone would pause long enough to really see him. But that was the quiet tragedy of this moment. The NBA taught Scottie that his value lay in his ability to disappear into the system, not in asserting himself. And when a person learns to survive by erasing himself, the price doesn't come all at once. It accumulates over time. The 1987 draft wasn't the start of a dream, but the marker of a rule that would follow Scottie throughout his career. Chosen to sacrifice, used to keep everything from collapsing, then stepped over when the story needed a different face at the center. In the moment he stepped into the NBA, without a real welcome, Scottie Pippen didn't know he was stepping into a dynasty that would make history, and at the same time, stepping into a life where his presence would always be seen as necessary, but rarely as indispensable. Scottie Pippen entered his early years with the Chicago Bulls, like an apprentice in a system that already had its order, where every movement served a single purpose, winning in the way it had been predefined. No one told him outright that he had to become invisible, but everything he was taught led to that conclusion. He was taught to run non-stop so others could have space to score, taught to cut to the dark corners of the court to draw defenders away, taught to defend the hardest positions so the spotlight could shine elsewhere. When Scottie did well, the scoreboard tilted toward the Bulls. The crowd stood and cheered, but rarely was his name the one chanted. Those cheers were for the game-winning shot, for the finishing moment, for the person allowed to end the story, while Scottie was the one keeping that story from falling apart in the middle. Gradually, he understood that his value on this team wasn't in being seen, but in not interrupting anyone else's shine. It was a harsh lesson, but familiar to someone raised in poverty, where your existence was only accepted when you didn't add more burden. Scottie learned to read the game with the instinct of someone always standing behind, knowing when to surge forward, when to step back, when to vanish from the frame so the system could run smoothly. And right there, the concept of perfect teammate began to cling to him like a compliment with thorns. At first, it sounded like recognition, a player who did everything right, sacrificed for the group, didn't demand, didn't complain. But over time, Scottie realized it was also a subtle trap. Every time he fulfilled his role perfectly, the Bulls got stronger, won more, but his image in the shared story shrank. He became such a perfect background that people forgot to ask whether that background could stand on its own. On the court, Scottie carried tasks few wanted, defending the opponent's most dangerous player, handling the ball to stabilize the pace when needed, passing so others could shine. Those jobs didn't create highlights, weren't replayed endlessly on TV, but without them, the system would collapse. Scottie knew that, and he kept doing it, because life had forged in him the belief that value lies in how long you can keep everything standing, not in how loudly you're praised. In the locker room, Scottie was rarely the one talking much. He observed, listened, and adjusted himself to fit. He understood that the Bulls didn't need another big ego. They needed someone willing to bend himself to fill every gap. And Scottie did it with near absolute dedication, not because he lacked ambition, but because he'd learned very early that personal ambition is often the first thing sacrificed when the family, or in this case, the team needs you. With each passing game, Scottie ran more, collided more, endured more, and slowly his body began carrying marks the lights never reached. The repeated impacts, the unrelenting defense, the seemingly small dives to save loose balls, all accumulated into a price only he truly felt. But when victory came, when the trophy was raised, the story was told in the familiar way, and Scottie stood there, beside it, as if his presence was simply obvious. No one asked whether those great moments could have existed if he hadn't run, hadn't defended, hadn't accepted being overshadowed. The better he performed his role, the more clearly Scottie was shaped into the position the system wanted, the perfect sacrificer. And while outside, the label perfect teammate was celebrated as a noble virtue, inside, Scottie began to feel the slow erosion of his sense of self. He didn't lose it in one moment, but across hundreds of small decisions. Passing instead of shooting, stepping back instead of stepping up, staying silent instead of speaking out. The system rewarded him with wins, but never gave back the feeling that he was the center of anything. Scottie understood he was living a double life right on the court. On one side, he was an indispensable pillar of the Bulls. On the other, he was always mentioned last, if at all. Every Bulls win made the system stronger, the dynasty more solid, and Scottie stepped one more pace back into the shadow of the story. The most painful part wasn't that he wasn't cheered. It was that he began to believe he shouldn't be cheered, that his role was to make others shine. And if he did that well enough, that was reward enough. But that very belief bound Scottie to an image he could hardly escape. The image of someone always right, but rarely seen fully. Looking back, it's clear that the Bulls taught Scottie how to become invisible so their greatness could exist. And Scottie learned that lesson faster than anyone. He became an irreplaceable part of the winning machine, but also the part most easily omitted when the story needed simplifying. Every time he did it right, the system ran smoother. And every time, Scottie Pippen shrank a little more in collective memory until his sacrifice was taken as a given, and the man himself gradually faded into the background of a dynasty he helped keep standing. The contract that Scottie Pippen signed wasn't written in a moment of calm, and it wasn't decided with the confidence of someone who fully understood his own worth. It was signed in fear. Fear that if he didn't grab what was in his hands, he would have nothing left to bring home to his family. Fear that if he gambled and waited, the fragile door life had so rarely opened would slam shut forever. When Scottie put pen to paper on a 7-year deal at a salary far below his true value, he wasn't thinking about the market, wasn't thinking about the distant future, and certainly wasn't thinking about how the NBA was about to explode. In his mind at that moment, there was only one image: the poorhouse in Arkansas, his father lying motionless after the stroke, his disabled brother, and a family that had never known what financial security felt like. Scottie didn't sign the contract like a star negotiating. He signed like a son, trying to make sure there would be money for medicine tomorrow, that his family wouldn't have to face the fear of being abandoned by the healthcare and social systems one more time. It wasn't simple ignorance. It was the direct consequence of a childhood trained by helplessness, where every decision revolved around avoiding immediate risk rather than maximizing long-term value. When that contract took effect, Scottie had no idea he had just locked his life into an invisible cage, one that would tighten with each passing year as the NBA began to change. The 1990s saw the league explode like never before. Global television, massive endorsement deals, star salaries skyrocketing. Players from Scottie's generation started signing contracts with staggering numbers. Yet, Scottie, the one shouldering the heaviest burdens of a dynasty, remained bound by an outdated deal signed in the fear of the past. With each passing season, the gap between his contributions and his pay widened like a crack that kept growing without anyone rushing to fix it, because the system still ran smoothly on his sacrifice. Scottie wasn't blind. He saw the injustice clearly. He knew he was being painfully underpaid, knew that what he brought to the Bulls far exceeded the figure on his paycheck. The anger built day by day, not exploding, but sinking deeper, heavier. But at the same time, the old fear never left him. Fear that if he pushed back, if he made noise, if he disrupted the order, he would be seen as a troublemaker, as someone who didn't know his place. Fear that the system would find another gear cheaper, easier to control and push him out. Scottie stood between two opposing forces. On one side, a growing awareness of his value and rights. On the other, the survival instinct forged in poverty, always reminding him that safety, even unfair safety, was better than risk. And so, he chose silence once more. This silence didn't come from weakness, but from memories of days when one wrong decision could drag the whole family into the abyss. To the public, Scottie Pippen was a star playing on the greatest team in the world. In reality, he was a man trapped in an agreement signed by the most frightened version of himself. That financial tragedy wasn't just about money. It was about power and voice. Every Bulls win, every reinforcement of the dynasty, turned Scottie's silence into proof of team spirit, when in truth, it was the mark of a man not given enough space to protect himself. He tried to renegotiate, but those efforts came from a position of weakness, when the system had grown accustomed to him accepting less. And when the door to change closed, Scottie was forced to live with his decision, carrying the bitterness he wasn't allowed to speak aloud. That decade passed in a state of prolonged contradiction. He was one of the most important players in the league, yet he had to watch his value undervalued compared to those he protected on the court. The anger sometimes surfaced in controversial decisions, in moments when Scottie seemed to try to reclaim a rare bit of control. But then, as always before, he stepped back because breaking the system meant facing his deepest fear, returning to the position of the boy with nothing to lean on. That 7-year contract didn't just lock Scottie Pippen financially. It locked him into a psychological role he'd carried since childhood, the role of the one who accepts less to make sure everything doesn't collapse. Looking back, it's easy to blame him for signing a terrible deal, but far harder to understand that choice was born from a life that never allowed him to believe he deserved more. Scottie's tragedy wasn't in the numbers on his paycheck, but in how his silence was exploited by the system for an entire decade, turning endurance into something taken for granted and leaving him with a lingering wound. The feeling that even when you do everything right, you can still be trapped in a decision signed by your own fear. 6 NBA championships, 6 times raising the trophy, 6 seasons ending in cheers, confetti falling, historic photos framed while the sweat was still fresh. Scottie Pippen was there for every single one of those moments, never absent, never on the outside, never arriving late. He was there from the beginning to the end of the dynasty, from the early building years to the final moment when everything started to crack. But every trophy raised, every banner hung from the rafters, every story retold carried a different name. History chose to tell about the game-winning shots, the defining moments, the faces predetermined to represent the era. Scottie stood beside them, hand on the exact same trophy, but ownership of the story never belonged to him. He wasn't excluded from the lineup, wasn't benched, wasn't left behind in the most important years. He was excluded from the story in a far more subtle way, through history's simplification, by turning his complex, silent contributions into something so obvious it didn't need to be mentioned. Every time the Bulls won a championship, Scottie fulfilled his role perfectly, defending the opponent's star, handling the ball to stabilize when needed, running relentlessly so others could have space to shine. He did things no one else on the team could do at the same level, but those things weren't easy to capture in a single frame or a newspaper headline. They existed like the internal structure of a building. No one praises the pillars when admiring the facade, but without them, everything collapses. And so, with each championship, the Bulls grew stronger, the legend grew bigger, and Scottie was framed tighter and tighter in the role of the perfect supporter. At the celebration ceremonies, as the cameras panned slowly across the winning faces, Scottie still smiled, still stood there, still did exactly what he'd always done, not taking center stage. But inside, a quiet question began to form not as resentment, but as a smoldering confusion. If I was present in all these moments, why, when the story is retold, am I always the one standing after the comma? History didn't say Scottie wasn't important. It just acted as if his importance didn't need to be emphasized. And that was the cruelest way to erase a person. Not by denying them, but by removing them from the center. The 6 trophies didn't give Scottie a sense of ownership. They gave him a sense of duty fulfilled. Each time a season ended, he went home with a more exhausted body, deeper pains, and a clearer realization that the reward for his sacrifice wasn't a voice. It was the demand to sacrifice more. As the dynasty continued, the system relied on Scottie more and more, but the story revolved around him less and less. He became a necessary condition, but never the sufficient one. And in the world of legends, that means you'll always be remembered as secondary, even though without you, the primary couldn't exist. Scottie didn't resist this loudly. He didn't launch campaigns for recognition, didn't disrupt the locker room, didn't refuse his role, partly because he understood that winning was the only thing keeping everything standing, partly because he was used to his value only being acknowledged when it served someone else. But that silence came at a cost. Every time the trophy was handed over, Scottie felt like he was giving away another piece of ownership over his own life's story. The kids who grew up watching the Bulls learned the names of those who were celebrated, while Scottie became a name mentioned last, if at all. Not because he was lesser, but because his role was too complex to tell in a simple story. The 6 championships should have been proof of his historical status, but for Scottie, they became evidence of a painful paradox. You can win everything with a team and still never be seen as the owner of that victory. He wasn't pushed out of the lineup, wasn't cut from the contract, wasn't completely forgotten. He was kept just enough for the dynasty to survive, then pushed out of the center of collective memory as soon as the story needed a simpler image. Looking back at the 6 trophies, Scottie Pippen didn't see failure. He saw a life fully used, but never granted ownership. He saw that he had done everything asked of him, and more, and in return received a faded position in the story he helped build. 6 championships, none without Scottie Pippen's fingerprints, but also 6 championships, none with his name on the front page of history. And that is the core tragedy of this dynasty. Scottie was never excluded from the team. He was only excluded from the way the world remembers that team. The summer of 1993, when Michael Jordan announced his retirement, the NBA didn't just lose its biggest star. The Chicago Bulls lost the single axis. Their entire universe had grown accustomed to revolving around. And in that void, for the first time in years, Scottie Pippen was no longer standing behind the lights. He stood at the center, not because he was given power, but because there was no one else left to shield him. The whole team looked to him. The whole city looked to him. And for the first time in his NBA life, Scottie Pippen stepped onto the court as the one carrying the entire system on his shoulders. Not the greatest supporter, not Jordan's right-hand man, but the true leader. Scottie Pippen's 1993 to 1994 season wasn't just a good season. It was an MVP-level season. 22 points per game, nearly 9 rebounds, over 5 assists, devastating defense, leading a team viewed as post-Jordan to 55 wins. The Bulls didn't collapse. The Bulls didn't disappear. They survived, and survived strongly, because Scottie Pippen dragged that entire structure forward with his will, his mind, and his body. He did everything. Scored when needed. Organized when the team was in chaos. Defended the opponent's star every night. Took the hits. Took the pressure. Took the endless comparisons. But the paradox was this. The more brilliantly he played, the less he was recognized. The media called it Phil Jackson's system. People said the Bulls stayed strong because of the foundation Jordan left. No one said Scottie Pippen had become the sole operating center of a team once accustomed to living in the shadow of a god. Then the playoffs arrived. Tension rose. Pressure mounted. And in a moment that lasted less than a few seconds, history chose one frame to judge his entire person. A pivotal game, a decisive moment. Phil Jackson drew up the final play. The ball didn't go to Scottie Pippen. It went to Tony Kukoc. Scottie, the one who had carried the team all season, who had played at MVP level, who had kept the Bulls alive for a full year without Jordan reacted. He didn't take the court for that possession. An impulsive decision. An emotional moment. A second of weakness from a man who had endured too long. And that was enough. No one asked why a man who had been silent throughout his career erupted at that exact moment. No one asked what it felt like for a person to stand at the center for the first time, only to have decision-making power stripped away at the very instant that defined leadership. No one asked why a man so accustomed to sacrifice couldn't bear being sidelined when it was finally his turn. The media didn't analyze. They condemned. Selfish. Unprofessional. Not fit to lead. 1 second replayed endlessly on television, stripped of all context, torn from the season he had given everything to. Scottie Pippen's honor wasn't destroyed by that action. It was destroyed by the way the world chose to remember it. 1 year of carrying the team compressed into a single frame. An MVP-level season erased by one imperfect moment. And the cruelest part is, Scottie Pippen didn't fight back. He didn't hold a press conference to explain. He didn't write an open letter. He didn't point fingers. He swallowed it all inside, the way he had done his entire life. Because from childhood, he had learned that resistance doesn't change the system. Only endurance lets you survive. That season should have been Scottie Pippen's moment of liberation. It should have been the year he was recognized as an independent star, a true leader, but instead, it became the biggest scar in his public image. When Jordan returned, the story snapped back to its old axis. Scottie stepped back again, and the 1994 frame became the evidence history pulled out whenever it needed to remind everyone that he wasn't big enough to stand alone. But the truth runs much deeper. That was the year Scottie Pippen did what his entire career had taught him not to do: step forward. And the price for that was public humiliation. Not because he was inadequate, but because the world was never truly ready to see him as a full human being with emotions, limits, and pain. 1993 to 1994 didn't bring Scottie Pippen redemption. It brought him a bitter lesson. Even when you do everything right, history can still pick one wrong moment to define you forever. The world once saw Scottie Pippen at his strongest, but it never truly saw him. The 1992 Olympics was a global stage, where the biggest names in American basketball converged in a lineup called the Dream Team, where every sprint was broadcast live. Every shot became iconic, every moment packaged for history. Amid those blinding lights, Scottie Pippen wasn't assigned to create the moments. He was assigned to protect them. He was the defensive backbone of a team overflowing with offense, taking the toughest matchups, the quietest assignments, the movements no one rewound. When the opponent needed to be locked down, Scottie stepped up. When the pace needed control, Scottie stood in the middle. When the structure threatened to crack, Scottie patched it with his silent presence. No highlights, no plays to sell, no game-winning shots to print on magazine covers. What he did wasn't for instant thrill. It was for long-term stability. And in a lineup where excitement was currency, stability became invisible. The Dream Team crushed every opponent. Victory after victory. Margins so large that games sometimes felt like exhibitions. In the historic photos, people saw smiles, raised arms, faces history had already chosen to represent the era. Scottie was there, always there, but rarely at the center of the frame. He was the one running ahead to cut off passes, the one dropping back to cover, the one reading the game for the whole team. He shielded the team from risks, from surprises, from moments that could tarnish the perfect story. But the cruel paradox was, while he protected them, no one protected him from how history would retell this story. No one said the Dream Team needed Scottie to exist. No one emphasized that the dominance was built on his disciplined, intelligent defense. Because what Scottie didn't create memorable images. It created the conditions for other images to shine. When the Olympics ended, the gold medals were handed out. and the story was neatly packaged. The world remembered the shots, the smiles, the icons. Scottie returned to the NBA with a medal in hand, and his familiar place in collective memory, essential but unmentioned. That silence wasn't random forgetfulness. It was the consequence of how modern basketball chooses to honor. What can't be slowed down into a sellable moment gets pushed to the margins. Scottie understood that. He had understood for a long time. And so he didn't demand. He kept working. He kept taking the tasks that, without someone to take them, the whole structure would wobble. But prolonged silence has its price. Every time a major tournament passed, without proportional recognition, Scottie learned another bitter lesson about story ownership. You can be there when history is made, but if you don't create the moment to sell, you don't get to retell that history. The Dream Team was the clearest example of this paradox. The whole world looked at that lineup and saw perfection. Few looked deeper to see the structure keeping that perfection from collapsing. Few realized that behind the scoring were defensive plays that snuffed out hope, pace-cutting runs, right decisions in unnoticed moments. Scottie made those decisions, continuously, precisely, without claiming credit. When he returned to the NBA, that burden didn't lighten. On the contrary, it grew heavier because of expectations. After the Olympics, Scottie entered the next season as someone who had proven he could stand beside the greatest and handle the hardest work. But proving it in silence meant having no shield when something went wrong. No one spoke for him. No one stepped up to provide context when he was judged. The Olympics taught Scottie that global acclaim doesn't guarantee personal protection. You can be the backbone of a great lineup, but when the story needs a central character, the backbone gets hidden behind the shiny outer skin. In the Dream Team, Scottie didn't fail. He performed his role at the highest level, but that success didn't translate into storytelling power. It only reinforced the old role, the one who does things right, at the right time, in the right place, so others can be seen. And so, when the following years brought him controversies, edited moments, unfair judgments, the 1992 Olympics didn't become a shield. It became a beautiful but lonely memory, not strong enough to resist how history likes to simplify. The Dream Team showed the world the collective strength of American basketball, but it also exposed another truth. The world can look very closely and still not see what doesn't fit the story they want to tell. Scottie Pippen protected the entire team in those days. He did it with precision, with intelligence, with tireless sacrifice. But when it was his turn to be protected from forgetfulness, from reduction, from being turned into a footnote in historic photos, no one stepped forward. And that is the quietest pain of a man accustomed to living in silence. You perform the task perfectly, and that very perfection makes you invisible. After the Olympics, after the seasons where Scottie Pippen quietly carried an entire system, his body became the only place that couldn't lie. What the public called durability was actually the accumulation of injuries, of cracks never properly healed at the right time. Scottie wasn't the type of player who played on explosive instinct and then took long rests. He played on relentless repetition, running, defending, colliding, shielding, filling gaps for others. And each time, his body paid a little price, very small, very quiet, to the point that no one saw it, not even him. The injuries started piling up early: shoulder, back, knees, feet. But Scottie wasn't allowed to stop. In a team where he had signed a low-cost contract that stretched for years, sitting out wasn't just a health issue, it was a financial risk. Every day, not on the court, felt like losing his right to exist in the system. So, when pain appeared, Scottie's first reflex wasn't treatment, it was delay. Delay surgery, delay rest. Delay, even admitting his body was breaking. He convinced himself he was still usable, that if he just gritted his teeth a little longer, the season would pass, the trophy would come, and then everything would be okay. But the body doesn't operate on the logic of titles. It remembers every collision, every run with an off-balance step, every jump off an overloaded knee. Scottie played in games where just stepping onto the court was a painful decision. There were nights he could barely feel the lower half of his body, yet he still showed up because no one else could do what he was doing. When others scored, the arena erupted. When Scottie dove in to defend, the arena just exhaled, and exhales don't leave memories. The decision to delay surgery during his peak years wasn't an impulsive mistake. It was the consequence of a lifetime taught that his value lay in his ability to endure. Scottie grew up in poverty, where adult bodies went to work despite pain, where illness wasn't a reason to stop, it was a burden to carry. That habit followed him into the NBA. He was used to putting the system's needs above his own, and the system, which has no memory or compassion, quietly accepted that sacrifice. When he retired, there was no ceremony grand enough to announce the real price that would come. Scottie didn't leave the NBA in a dramatic collapse. He left quietly, carrying a worn-out body. Chronic pain became a constant companion. Walking became limited. Simple movements, climbing stairs, bending down, standing up, all required calculation. The body that once covered the entire court now had to negotiate every step. No more adrenaline, no more cheers to mask it. Just him and the history his body now carried. The bitterest thing is, these pains weren't caused by one single wrong moment. They are the sum of thousands of right decisions. Right for the team, right for the system, right for victory, but not right for himself. Scottie didn't break because of one fateful collision. He broke because he became the foundation for too long. Foundations aren't praised when the building stands tall, but they are always the first to crack when the weight increases. In the years after retirement, when people look back at the Chicago Bulls dynasty through footage and stories, Scottie's body is the place that holds the uneditable truth. Every ache reminds him that he was there, that he worked, that he endured even when the official story never paused long enough to acknowledge it. His body carries enough history that no one else has to. The history of defensive plays never rewound, runs that opened space for others to shine, seasons played in pain. So the trophy stayed exactly where the system wanted it. And right in that physical limitation, a different kind of dignity emerges. Scottie doesn't display his pain to reclaim credit. He doesn't use his damaged body as an accusation. He lives slower, quieter, as if accepting that the rest of his life will be the phase of paying back for the years he gave too much. Not everyone understands that. But if you look closely enough, you'll see. This isn't the story of a body weakening. It's the story of a man who carried for so many others that there's nothing left to carry except his own history. After leaving the court, Scottie Pippen stepped into a phase he was never prepared for. A life where fame no longer stayed, confined within four boundaries, but flooded straight into his home without knocking, without permission. His marriage to Larsa opened an entirely new front, not on the basketball court, but in private life, where Scottie had never been trained to survive. Throughout his career, he had learned to endure silence in front of sports media, learned to let others speak his story for him. But he had never learned how to defend himself when that story shifted to his personal life, where every detail could be dissected, judged, and turned into headlines. Scottie wasn't the type to seek the spotlight. He didn't build an image, didn't control the narrative, didn't understand the rules of entertainment media. For him, family was the last refuge, the only space not measured, not ranked, not compared. But fame doesn't respect those boundaries. When his marriage became public fodder, Scottie was thrust into a completely unfamiliar role, a character in a story he didn't write, didn't direct, and couldn't edit. Every prying gaze, every comment, every judgment happened where he was weakest, not because he was wrong, but because he had never learned how to defend. Tabloid media didn't ask what he had gone through to become the person he was. They didn't care about a childhood of poverty, a career built on sacrifice, or a body that had paid enough for collective wins. They just needed images, drama, contrast. And Scottie, the man used to living behind the lights, suddenly became the center of a far more ruthless spotlight than the court ever was. On the court, he knew the rules. He knew if he defended well, the team would win. In public life, there were no such clear rules. His silence, the thing once seen as a virtue, was now interpreted as weakness, as lack of backbone, as not being in control of his own life. Family, which had been Scottie's place of safety, gradually became a battlefield. Not because he didn't love, but because he wasn't used to fighting in that space. He didn't know how to answer the press without hurting loved ones. He didn't know how to protect privacy when everything had already been dragged into the light. And more importantly, he didn't know how to put himself first, because his whole life had taught him that value lay in yielding space. When the media dug deeper, when public opinion judged, Scottie chose the familiar path: silence, endurance, hoping the storm would pass if he did nothing more. But unlike on the court, silence in private life doesn't end the game. It only prolongs the hurt. The most painful thing wasn't that fame invaded his home. It was that Scottie had no tools to fight it. He wasn't someone who liked to argue, wasn't good at telling his own story. He was used to letting accomplishments speak for him. But in a world of scandals and clickbait headlines, accomplishments carried no weight. His family got pulled into a whirlwind he couldn't control, and for the first time in his life, Scottie felt powerless in a different way. Not powerless before poverty or the sports system, but powerless before the way the world consumes personal lives as entertainment. Fame, which had once stayed at a safe distance while he played, now became direct pressure. It didn't just shine on him, it shone on everyone he loved. And Scottie, the man who once protected an entire team, didn't know how to protect his own family from those lights. He had no playbook, no diagram, no coach, just the old instinct of someone used to enduring. Family became the new front not because Scottie wanted to fight, but because he had no other choice. What happened in private space got turned into public story, and Scottie was placed in the position of being responsible for an image he never actively created. In that world, there are no crowds cheering for quiet sacrifice, no applause for patience, only quick judgments and short memories. And so, a man who spent his whole life standing behind the lights, protecting others, enduring for the collective, had to face a bitter truth. When fame walks into your home uninvited, it doesn't bring compassion. It only brings scrutiny. And Scottie Pippen, who never learned how to defend against public opinion, was forced to learn that lesson later than anyone, in silence, in pain, and in a battle with no scoreboard to tell when it ends. There are losses that can't be handled with experience, can't be fit into a system, and can't be overcome with the steel discipline that once helped a man survive poverty, injustice, and even the NBA. The death of Pippen, Scottie Pippen's eldest son, was that kind of moment. When the bad news arrived, every language Scottie had ever used to survive collapsed. There was no playbook for this pain, no role for him to shoulder, no doing it right or doing enough to keep everything standing. On the court, Scottie always knew what to do when the world went chaotic. Defend, cover, run for someone else's part. But in the face of Pippen's death, he had no next move, only emptiness. Antron left too soon, taking a piece of the heart Scottie had saved for family after giving almost everything to basketball. As a father, Scottie wasn't behind the lights. He stood in the rawest position of a human being, powerless before his child's pain. Then, even more powerless when he couldn't keep his child here. Every philosophy of endurance life had taught him suddenly became meaningless. Because endurance always implies the pain can be carried forward, that if you grit your teeth long enough, it will ease. But some pains don't ease. They only grow quieter, deeper, and stay there forever. After the funeral, the world expected Scottie to say something, a statement, a tribute, a proper way to face tragedy in public. But Scottie had no words. He withdrew not as an act of defiance, but as the natural reflex of someone who, for the first time, couldn't endure anymore. All his life, he had lived for others, done the work so things wouldn't collapse. This time, there was no structure for him to patch, no system for him to run. Family, the last refuge, was now torn open by loss. And Scottie, the man who had once stood firm against every pressure, was forced to admit what he had never allowed himself to say. He broke. Basketball never broke Scottie. Unfair contracts didn't break him. Mistold stories didn't break him. Piled-up injuries didn't break him. But his son's death did. It took away the only ability he had used to survive, the ability to keep going. No more drive to run one more step. No more reason to stay silent one more time. Just a prolonged quiet, where every sound became too loud. Scottie stepped away from the world not to escape, but to breathe, to exist in a different rhythm, slow enough that getting through each day on its own was enough. In those days, there were no lights, no cameras, no questions, and for the first time, Scottie allowed himself not to be the pillar. He didn't have to protect anyone. He didn't have to stand behind anyone. He didn't have to explain anything to anyone. A father's grief doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be respected. Scottie chose silence as a way to preserve what was left of himself, because if he opened his mouth, he feared he wouldn't be able to close it again. The world kept turning, as it always does. Games happened. New stories were told. But for Scottie, time was no longer linear. It fractured, stopped, then flowed backward in memory. Every memory with Antron became a gentle but deep cut. There was no way to get used to that absence, only a way to learn to live with it. And learning to live with grief was something Scottie had never been trained for. On the court, he knew how to stand firm. In life, he knew how to endure. But in the face of his son's death, he was only a father who lost his child. No titles, no roles, no armor. If there was one boundary basketball never reached in Scottie Pippen's life, it was this one. Here, every achievement becomes small. Every story of sacrifice becomes fragile, because no trophy can fill an empty chair at home. No medal can soothe a silent room, and no victory is big enough to cover the truth that some losses can't be overcome. They can only be carried. For the first time, Scottie didn't try to endure more. He allowed himself to stop, and in that stopping, a different dignity appeared. The dignity of a man who acknowledges his limits, not because of weakness, but because of love. Not because of giving up, but because he understood that some battles shouldn't be fought anymore. Scottie Pippen spent a lifetime built on endurance, but this loss taught him one final, most painful and truest lesson. Sometimes courage isn't standing firm one more time. It's allowing yourself to fall and still continuing to live in a different way. When The Last Dance premiered, Scottie Pippen was not mentally prepared to confront his own life through someone else's telling. He wasn't asked. He wasn't consulted. He wasn't invited to sit down and provide context for the years he had lived with flesh, blood, and decades of prolonged silence. For the first time in a long while, Scottie saw himself on screen not as a full human being, but as a convenient cut for a story already paced and predetermined. The selected moments, the emphasized commentary, the overlooked gaps, all came together into an image he immediately recognized. That wasn't the whole truth, and it wasn't the truth he had lived. In that series, Scottie was present, but voiceless. He appeared through decisions stripped of context, through emotional seconds framed into judgment. No one mentioned the years he carried the team in silence. No one questioned the conditions that forced him into unfair agreements. No one connected the pieces of poverty, illness, and loss to explain why he reacted as a human, not as an icon. History, when told without the voice of the person who lived it, easily becomes a convenient straight line that skips every painful turn. Scottie saw that straight line and realized that if he remained silent, this version would be the one that endured. The hurt didn't come from criticism. Scottie had been used to criticism his whole life. It came from being reduced, turned into a functional character in someone else's story, where dignity was measured by how well it served the climax. He had spent his entire career doing the work no one else wanted, and now even that was being retold as a flaw in his character. In the days after the series aired, Scottie faced a wave of commentary with no room for context. No one asked what he had sacrificed for the system to function. No one asked why a man who had stayed silent for so long had one moment of eruption. People only asked, right or wrong, in a single second. And then, after years of being accustomed to withdrawing, Scottie spoke. Not with the voice of someone chasing the spotlight, not with personal attacks. He spoke late, slowly, and measured like the way a man who had spent his life choosing restraint finally reached the final boundary. He didn't demand titles back. He didn't demand the record books be rewritten. He demanded the bare minimum any human deserves, the right to tell his own story with full context. Because for Scottie, staying silent one more time meant accepting that dignity could be omitted if it didn't fit the narrative rhythm. Speaking out didn't bring immediate relief. It opened a new cycle of judgment. But unlike before, Scottie didn't step back. He understood that silence had once helped him survive on the court, but it no longer protected him in the battle over memory. When history had been broadcast millions of times, when the image had been framed in the public mind, truth doesn't appear on its own. It needs someone to stand up and speak, even if late. And Scottie accepted the cost of speaking late because the cost of not speaking had already become too clear. In his words, Scottie didn't deny his personal mistakes. He didn't ask to erase the awkward moments. He only asked that they be placed in the right context within a life shaped by poverty, defined by sacrifice, and trapped in power structures he didn't create. He mentioned the years of underpaid work, the injuries played through in pain, the seasons carrying the team when no one else shielded him. Not to boast, to remind that a person is not a collection of disconnected clips. As The Last Dance continued to be rewatched, debates kept flaring up. But for Scottie, the most important thing had happened. He no longer let history pass by without pausing. Speaking late didn't erase the existing wounds, but it rebuilt a boundary, the boundary between criticism and dehumanization. Scottie didn't ask to be celebrated. He asked to be seen as a full human being, with context, with contradictions, with choices made under unfair conditions. At this stage of his life, Scottie didn't have much left to lose. Fame had come and gone. His body had paid enough. His family had weathered enough storms. What remained was dignity, something that couldn't be left entirely in someone else's telling. When he spoke, it wasn't a fight to rewrite history. It was an effort to remind history that it wasn't complete, that behind the sellable frames were years that were hard to live, that a person can be wrong in 1 second, but right in thousands of days. And so, for the first time in a very long while, Scottie Pippen didn't stand behind someone else's story. He stood beside his own truth, not to claim credit, to reclaim dignity. Only when looking back at the entire journey does one begin to understand the two-layered life Scottie Pippen never actively chose. On the court, he was an undeniable legend, present in every big moment, keeping the structure upright, doing the hardest things so victory could happen. But off the court, he was almost invisible, a man unaccustomed to telling his own story, unsure how to defend himself against systems that no longer needed his silence. Those two layers existed side by side for decades, not as a strategy, but as the consequence of how Scottie learned to survive from very early on. On the court, he was trained to become everything the team needed: the best defender, the one who ran the most, the one ready to give up the last shot if it meant the team won. There, sacrifice was rewarded with wins, even if recognition was never proportional. Off the court, those habits became burdens. Scottie kept yielding space, kept staying silent, kept believing that if he did it right, the world would understand on its own. But the world doesn't operate like a team. It doesn't automatically acknowledge what isn't spoken. And so, the gap between the legend on the court and the man off it grew wider and wider. Scottie didn't fail. Failure implies he tried and didn't reach the goal. But Scottie achieved everything the system demanded. Wins, stability, durability, discipline. What he didn't achieve was control over how he was perceived. He wasn't defeated by opponents. He was worn down by the very role he performed too perfectly. When you serve as the foundation long enough, people forget the foundation has load limits. When you carry enough, people take it as obligation, not as a choice. Basketball history often prefers straight lines: hero, climax, and conclusion. Scottie Pippen's life didn't follow that line. It was a repeating cycle of sacrifice, where every victory demanded the next sacrifice. And because there was no single explosive moment to frame, history chose to omit the context. It recorded the achievements but not the cost. It mentioned the titles but didn't linger on the years of erosion. It told of imperfect seconds, but not of thousands of quietly perfect days. When you understand that, you start to see Scottie's double life differently, not as a contradiction in character, but as a disconnect between personal value and how the system rewards. Scottie carried qualities every collective needs, but few systems know how to protect: patience, sacrifice, loyalty, silence. Those qualities made him a legend on the court, but left him vulnerable off it, where the louder voice usually gets heard more. And that's why Scottie's story isn't about if he had done things differently, everything would have been better. It's about a man shaped by circumstance to the point that his choices always leaned toward keeping everything from collapsing, even when the price was himself. He didn't choose to live two lives. He only chose to live. The only way life had taught him was safe. History doesn't record enough of that. It records more convenient moments: a bad contract, an emotional decision, a few late words. But if you look deeper, you'll see a different truth. Scottie Pippen is proof that you can do everything right for the collective and still be left out of collective memory. Not because you were lesser, but because the shared story has no room for quiet contributions. Understanding that two-layered life isn't about justification, it's about completing the picture. To see that the legend on the court and the man off it aren't two different people, but one person stretched between duty and self. To realize that Scottie doesn't need redemption through belated praise, he needs to be seen correctly, as a man who was used up so many others could shine. And perhaps, when history finally learns to pause longer, to ask why instead of just right or wrong, Scottie Pippen's life will no longer be split into two layers. It will be understood as a painful but resilient whole. A man who didn't fail, didn't collapse, only used too long in silence, and never fully recognized for it. In the end, Scottie Pippen's story doesn't open a door to redemption. It doesn't close with a comeback, nor with a full reconciliation with history, the public, or even himself. That life isn't repaid with belated justice. It simply leaves the raw truth of a man who walked a far longer road than most stories tell. Scottie didn't step out of the shadows to be embraced. He stepped out to stand upright, carrying what remained, and no longer hiding. There is no miracle at the end. No single moment where all misunderstandings are wiped clean. Scottie Pippen doesn't get history bowing its head in apology. The frames that aired still exist. The simplified stories still get repeated. Collective memory still prefers convenience over complexity. But what has changed is Scottie's position in his own life. After all those years of silence, he no longer tries to bend himself to fit someone else's story. He doesn't fight for center stage. He simply refuses to disappear. Truth, when looked at straight on, is never romantic. Truth says Scottie Pippen was used thoroughly by the system, that he sacrificed more than any human should have to, that those brilliant victories weren't free at all, and the heaviest part of the bill didn't land on the table of the one who got the most applause. Truth also says Scottie wasn't perfect. He had moments of weakness, emotional decisions, reactions born from years of accumulated fatigue. But unlike how history usually works, truth doesn't cut those moments out of context. It places them exactly where they belong, in a life stretched to its limit. Scottie isn't fully healed. Family losses have no solution. His body doesn't go back to the way it was. Chronic pain doesn't vanish just because time passes. There are mornings when simply getting up is a reminder that he paid with his own flesh. But Scottie isn't seeking healing in the conventional sense. He doesn't try to return to the stage to prove anything anymore. He accepts that some wounds don't need to disappear for life to continue. There is also no full reconciliation. Not with teammates, not with the media, not with the way history was told. Scottie doesn't go looking for consensus. He doesn't need everyone to agree with him. He just needs to no longer be distorted. In that belated silence, a different dignity emerges, the dignity of refusing permission to exist only as someone else's version of his experience. Scottie doesn't rewrite history. He places beside it a fuller, more painful version, and lets time do the rest. What remains, when all the glory has faded, isn't titles. The titles were hung long ago. It isn't belated recognition. Recognition, if it comes, can't return the lost years. What remains is endurance not as a virtue to be praised, but as a fact that must be acknowledged. Scottie endured so the system could run, endured so his family could be safe, endured so the team wouldn't collapse, and, in the end, endured so he wouldn't vanish in the way others told his story. In his later years, Scottie doesn't stand on a high podium looking down at the past. He stands level with it. No excessive resentment, no rose tinting, just a man looking back at the road he walked, understanding that he paid enough for what he got and for what he never received. Some people live to be remembered. Scottie lived so everything wouldn't collapse. And in a world always searching for heroes, that role is rarely honored. America's Stars doesn't tell this story to find a beautiful ending, because, for Scottie Pippen, beauty was never in the conclusion. It was in the fact that he still stood after everything that could have broken another person. Not because he was stronger, but because he was used to carrying. And when you carry long enough, you don't collapse, you just wear down. Scottie Pippen didn't live to become a legend. He lived so others could become legends, and carried that price for the rest of his life. The story of Scottie Pippen leaves a quiet, lingering sadness, not loud, but long, because his tragedy didn't come from failure, but from being used up in silence. From childhood in Hamburg, Arkansas, where poverty, illness, and helplessness taught him to endure rather than resist, to his NBA career, where he learned to become invisible so the system could run, Scottie always did exactly what the world demanded, but was rarely asked how much it cost him. The 7-year low-cost contract, signed in fear that his family wouldn't have money for medicine, the 1993 to 1994 season, carrying the Bulls at MVP level, but reduced by history to one judged frame, or his role as the defensive backbone of the 1992 Dream Team, with no highlights to sell all, show a repeating pattern. The greater the contribution, the smaller the recognition. That pain grew heavier when his body carried enough injuries so others didn't have to, when fame invaded his family life like a new battlefield, and finally, with the irreplaceable loss, the death of his son Antron, the first moment he couldn't endure anymore. Speaking out late after the last dance wasn't to claim credit, but to reclaim dignity, the right to tell his own story with full context. The lesson for Americans from this story isn't about basketball, but about modern life. A society that celebrates performance but forgets to protect the person behind the performance will soon run out of its best people. Learn to recognize quiet contributions, set healthy boundaries, and don't mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes the price of doing it right for too long is losing yourself. If the story of Scottie Pippen made you pause and look differently at the quiet sacrifices behind the glory, please hit subscribe to the channel and drop a like so we can keep telling raw, honest stories like this. Thank you for listening all the way to the end, and see you in the next video where we'll continue exploring great, painful, and deeply human lives behind the spotlight.